At 64, Aaron Sorkin is remembered as one of the sharpest minds television ever produced, the man who turned political dialogue into cultural memory. But long before the accolades settled into legacy, there was a moment that split his life in two. In April 2001, his arrest at Hollywood Burbank Airport exposed what those closest to him already knew: brilliance was colliding with self-destruction. The world kept applauding the words, while behind the scenes relationships were cracking under pressure control and quiet resentment. Today we trace 5 names Aaron Sorkin could never forgive, and at the very top of that list stands Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner, the mentor who became a cage. When Aaron Sorkin first entered Hollywood, few people believed in him as completely as Rob Reiner. Reiner did not simply option a script or attach his name for prestige. He intervened, protected and guided, stepping into a role that went far beyond professional collaboration. At a time when Sorkin's talent was undeniable, but his discipline fragile, Reiner provided structure, advocacy, and credibility. He shielded Sorkin from studios, negotiated on his behalf, and absorbed risks that others were unwilling to take. For Sorkin, this support was life-saving. For Reiner, it affirmed a self-image rooted in stewardship and control. Early successes reinforced the arrangement. Sorkin delivered razor-sharp dialogue that elevated projects, while Reiner managed the environment around him, smoothing conflicts and enforcing limits. What appeared from the outside as mentorship, however, slowly evolved into dependence. As Sorkin's personal struggles intensified, the boundaries between help and authority blurred. Reiner's involvement expanded, touching not only creative decisions but behavior schedules and accountability. He believed he was preserving the work. Sorkin began to feel preserved against his will. The turning point was not a single argument, but a shift in power. As Sorkin's public stature grew, his tolerance for oversight diminished. He no longer saw Reiner's interventions as guidance, but as constraint reminders of a period he was desperate to escape. Reiner, accustomed to influence behind the scenes, did not retreat easily. His insistence on structure felt necessary to him, yet increasingly paternal to the person receiving it. Conversations hardened. Creative disagreements took on personal weight. According to those close to the productions, Sorkin bristled at decisions that once felt protective, interpreting them as signals that he was still viewed as unstable, still someone who required supervision. The rupture became inevitable when Sorkin recognized that independence would never coexist with that dynamic. To move forward, he had to sever the relationship that had defined his ascent. The separation was quiet but decisive. Collaboration stopped. Calls ceased. Public remarks remained respectful, carefully neutral. But the absence of future work spoke louder than any explanation. For Reiner, the loss was deeply personal. He had invested not only professional capital but emotional labor, believing that loyalty entitled him to continued influence. Instead, he was left confronting a painful truth: the very care he extended had become the reason he was pushed away. For Sorkin, the break carried its own cost. Cutting ties with the person who had seen him at his weakest meant abandoning a safety net he might never fully replace. Yet the resentment lingered, rooted in the belief that Reiner's presence had frozen him in an earlier version of himself. What made this relationship uniquely bitter was its intimacy. This was not rivalry between equals or a transactional fallout. It was a bond forged in vulnerability and broken by the need for autonomy. Reiner later spoke broadly about the limits of helping someone who no longer wants to be helped, words many recognized as reflection rather than abstraction. Sorkin, for his part, framed his growth as a reclaiming of control, rarely revisiting the past directly. Between them remains a silence shaped by unresolved grievance. The mentor who once opened doors became the reminder of a chapter Sorkin wanted erased. In choosing freedom, he accepted estrangement. In offering guidance, Reiner lost a collaborator he believed he had saved. Neither publicly accused the other, yet the break was absolute. They never worked together again. Studio executives the system that let him fall. When Aaron Sorkin became the engine behind a cultural phenomenon, the studios around him treated success as proof that everything was under control. Networks and production partners praised his output, protected his deadlines, and quietly absorbed disruptions because the results justified the inconvenience. In that environment, accountability softened. What mattered was that the pages arrived and the dialogue landed. As long as the machine kept running, concern remained conditional. Sorkin felt both empowered and insulated, convinced that his value secured him a margin of error others never received. That belief would eventually collide with reality. When his personal struggles became impossible to compartmentalize, the same system that once buffered him recalculated. Executives who had tolerated chaos as the cost of genius began to view it as liability. Meetings shifted in tone. Conversations that once centered on ideas pivoted toward risk. Support turned procedural. The unspoken contract changed without notice. The decisive moment arrived when institutional patience ran out. Faced with mounting pressure and public scrutiny, the studios chose stability over loyalty, removing Sorkin from the very world he had helped build. To Sorkin, the action felt like abandonment. He had delivered cultural relevance awards and ratings. In return, he expected protection during collapse. What he received instead was distance framed as responsibility. The injury was not only professional, but personal. Being cut off by a faceless system stung precisely because it confirmed a fear he had long avoided, that his worth was transactional. Colleagues later recalled how abruptly the doors closed, how quickly access vanished once authority shifted. The system did not argue with him or explain itself. It moved on. In public statements, executives spoke carefully about change and continuity, avoiding any language that suggested blame. Privately, Sorkin absorbed the message as rejection. The aftermath reshaped his worldview. Where he once believed excellence could secure allegiance, he now understood that institutions do not love individuals. They manage them. This realization hardened into resentment, not because the decision lacked logic, but because it exposed the conditional nature of the relationship. Sorkin's anger was directed less at specific people than at the machinery that had benefited from his vulnerability before discarding it. The experience deepened his mistrust of corporate guardianship and reinforced his determination to reclaim control over his work. Yet the damage lingered. Losing institutional backing meant losing the illusion of safety that had allowed his excesses to persist unchecked. In that sense, the system's withdrawal was both punitive and corrective, a duality Sorkin struggled to accept. He spoke later about learning to stand alone, but the bitterness remained evident in how he described power and protection. For him, this rupture ranked among the most painful because it confirmed a brutal truth: when genius falters, institutions do not intervene out of loyalty. They intervene to protect themselves. The studio doors did not slam shut dramatically. They simply stopped opening. And once that happened, there was no path back. The system moved forward without him leaving Sorkin to reckon with the cost of believing success guaranteed shelter. Thomas Schlama, the partner, he burned out. When Aaron Sorkin partnered with Thomas Schlama, the collaboration felt symbiotic, almost telepathic. Schlama understood the velocity of Sorkin's writing, the musicality of overlapping dialogue, and the relentless pace required to bring those pages to life. Together, they defined the rhythm of modern political television, turning urgency into an aesthetic. Early on, the intensity energized both men. Long hours were framed as devotion. Exhaustion was worn like a badge of honor. But what began as shared ambition gradually shifted into imbalance. As Sorkin's personal struggles deepened, the pressure of sustaining the machine fell increasingly on Schlama. He compensated for missed deadlines, smoothed tensions on set, and absorbed the operational chaos that accompanied Sorkin's brilliance. Over time, partnership gave way to triage. Schlama was no longer just directing. He was stabilizing an environment that demanded constant intervention. Colleagues recalled how the workload became unsustainable, how the creative high was eclipsed by physical and emotional depletion. The breaking point arrived quietly, without a dramatic confrontation. Schlama recognized that continuing meant sacrificing his own well-being. Choosing to step back was not framed as betrayal, but Sorkin experienced it that way. To him, the departure felt like abandonment at the moment he needed loyalty most. The loss cut deep because it came from the person who understood his process better than anyone else. Unlike executives or mentors, Schlama had been in the trenches translating chaos into coherence. His exit signaled that even understanding had limits. The aftermath reshaped both men. Schlama moved forward carrying the knowledge that creative devotion cannot come at the expense of health. Sorkin left without his closest collaborator felt exposed. The separation forced him to confront the consequences of a work culture that demanded total immersion while offering little protection. Publicly, the split was handled with restraint. Praise replaced accusation. Gratitude stood in for explanation. Privately, resentment lingered. Sorkin struggled with the idea that intensity, once celebrated, had become the reason for distance. He framed the loss as circumstantial, but those close to him understood the wound as personal. The partnership's end marked a shift in how Sorkin's work was produced and perceived. Without Schlama's stabilizing presence, the cracks became more visible. For Sorkin, this rupture carried a unique sting because it challenged a belief he held dear that shared passion could withstand any cost. Schlama's departure proved otherwise. It demonstrated that partnership requires boundaries as much as commitment, and that ignoring those boundaries can fracture even the most aligned collaborations. In the years that followed, the two men spoke respectfully of each other, careful not to reopen old wounds. Yet the absence of renewed collaboration spoke volumes. What they built together defined an era, but it could not survive the conditions under which it was created. The bond did not end in anger, but in exhaustion. And for Sorkin, the lesson was unforgiving. Talent can demand everything, but it cannot demand forever. When Schlama chose to save himself, Sorkin was left to confront the cost of pushing brilliance beyond its breaking point. They never found their way back to the partnership that once defined them. David Fincher, when precision felt like control. When Aaron Sorkin collaborated with David Fincher, the pairing promised mastery. Fincher's reputation for exacting control and Sorkin's reputation for verbal velocity suggested a meeting of obsessions rather than egos. At first, the collaboration delivered results that validated the match. The work was sharp, disciplined, and critically celebrated, but beneath the surface, a fault line widened. Fincher's process demanded absolute precision, not only in framing and pacing, but in narrative emphasis. Nothing was sacred if it interfered with rhythm. For Sorkin, whose identity was bound to authorship and voice, that approach felt invasive. Dialogue was not just material, it was territory. As production progressed, decisions that Fincher viewed as refinement registered to Sorkin as erasure. Lines were trimmed, beats restructured, emphasis shifted. Fincher believed the film required it. Sorkin believed something essential was being taken from him. The tension did not erupt in public conflict. It manifested in controlled exchanges and quiet resistance. Those close to the production later described a growing chill, an atmosphere where respect remained but comfort vanished. Fincher's authority on set was unquestioned, and Sorkin, already sensitive to control, after earlier experiences, bristled at the imbalance. What made the situation personal was not disagreement, but implication. To Sorkin, the edits suggested a lack of trust in his instincts, a message that his voice required supervision. For Fincher, the edits were simply the job evidence that filmmaking is collaborative by necessity. The breaking point arrived not through argument, but through outcome. The project succeeded without Sorkin retaining full command of his work. In Hollywood, success often smooths over conflict. Here, it sharpened it. Sorkin walked away convinced that collaboration had come at the cost of autonomy. Fincher moved on secure in a process that had once again delivered. The aftermath was defined by absence. No follow-up projects materialized. No public disputes surfaced. Praise replaced proximity. In interviews, both men spoke respectfully, careful to frame the experience as productive. Yet the distance was unmistakable. For Sorkin, this rupture ranked as deeply personal because it struck at authorship, the one area he guarded most fiercely. It reinforced a belief that collaboration with dominant visionaries risks turning a writer into a component rather than a creator. The resentment was not loud, but it was enduring. Fincher's approach forced Sorkin to confront an uncomfortable truth. In certain rooms, his words were not the final authority. That realization lingered long after the film's release. It influenced how Sorkin chose collaborators and how tightly he held control thereafter. Where he once embraced partnership, he became more cautious, more defensive. The lesson he carried forward was clear. Precision can feel like respect to one person and domination to another. When creative power is uneven, even admiration can sour. The collaboration with Fincher did not end in hostility, but it ended something just as significant: Sorkin's willingness to surrender authorship in the name of perfection. They never reunited creatively. The silence that followed served as confirmation that the cost of that precision had been personal and for Sorkin unacceptable. William Goldman, the idol who never believed in him. Before Aaron Sorkin became a name synonymous with rapid-fire dialogue and moral certainty, there was one writer whose shadow loomed over him more than any other: William Goldman. Goldman represented legitimacy. He was the standard against which serious screenwriters were measured, the voice that defined what lasting cinematic writing looked like. Sorkin admired him openly, studied his work obsessively, and internalized his authority long before they ever crossed paths. That admiration made what followed deeply personal. When Goldman expressed skepticism about Sorkin's style and longevity, dismissing his voice as clever but limited, it landed not as critique but as invalidation. To Sorkin, it felt like being rejected by the very figure whose approval he believed would confirm his place in the canon. The wound was not inflicted in private whispers, but in comments that circulated within industry circles, reinforcing a narrative that Sorkin was a temporary phenomenon rather than a durable voice. For a writer already battling insecurity beneath confidence, the impact was profound. Goldman's dismissal triggered a compulsion to prove permanence, to write not just well, but relentlessly. The relationship never evolved into mentorship or rivalry in the traditional sense. It remained frozen at the point of judgment. Sorkin did not confront Goldman directly. He internalized the slight, allowing it to sharpen ambition into obsession. Friends later noted how intensely Sorkin reacted to any suggestion that his work relied on formula or bravado accusations that echoed Goldman's early skepticism. The absence of reconciliation turned admiration into resentment. Goldman, secure in his legacy, had little reason to revisit the exchange. Sorkin, still building his own, carried the weight of having been deemed insufficient by the one voice he respected most. The consequence was not collaboration lost, but innocence stripped away. This was the moment Sorkin learned that reverence offers no protection, that idols are capable of indifference, and that validation is never guaranteed, no matter the talent. The experience hardened his approach to criticism, making him defensive where he once sought guidance. It also reinforced a solitary mindset. If acceptance was conditional, then independence was safer. Years later, Sorkin spoke about the difficulty of living under comparison, of being measured against giants whose approval never comes. Though he rarely named Goldman directly, the influence was unmistakable. This final rupture mattered because it preceded all the others. It shaped how Sorkin interpreted disagreement, authority, and judgment. It planted the belief that respect must be taken, not given. Goldman may not have considered the exchange significant. For Sorkin, it was formative. The idol's doubt became a permanent echo, one that fueled success while poisoning peace. They never reconciled, not because of distance or circumstance, but because the damage occurred at the level of belief. Once admiration curdled into resentment, there was no path back. The writer Sorkin became was forged in response to that moment, driven by the need to outlast the doubt that defined him. In that sense, Goldman's skepticism achieved what no endorsement ever could. It reshaped Sorkin's relationship with approval itself, leaving behind a grievance that never required confrontation to endure. Aaron Sorkin's conflicts were never about enemies in the traditional sense. They were about proximity. Every rupture in his life followed the same pattern: admiration turning into pressure, collaboration, sliding into control, support, quietly becoming judgment. What makes these 5 relationships so revealing is not their drama, but their consistency. Each person represented something Sorkin wanted desperately at different stages of his life: protection, validation, precision, partnership, legitimacy. And each loss occurred the moment those things began to feel like limits instead of gifts. Sorkin did not walk away because he hated these people. He walked away because they saw him too clearly at moments he was trying to outgrow. Addiction magnified that tension, but it did not create it. Even after sobriety, the pattern remained. Control triggered resentment. Authority provoked resistance. Silence felt like abandonment. Over time, Sorkin learned to equate independence with survival, even when independence meant isolation. The cost of that lesson was steep. The safety nets vanished. The collaborators who once absorbed the fallout were gone. What remained was autonomy earned through rupture. In Hollywood, this narrative is often reframed as growth. But growth that requires burning bridges, leaves scars, no success can erase. Sorkin's legacy is secure. His dialogue is studied, his influence undeniable. Yet beneath the achievement lies a quieter truth. The same intensity that fuels his work destabilized the relationships that made it possible. Genius demanded freedom, and freedom demanded separation. The question his story leaves behind is not whether the conflicts were justified, but whether they were inevitable. Can a mind that thrives on control ever tolerate guidance? Can brilliance accept being seen without recoiling? Sorkin never offered a definitive answer. He moved forward instead, carrying both triumph and grievance. In the end, the most personal loss was not any single relationship, but the belief that success would make connection easier. It did not. It made it harder. And that may be the final contradiction of Aaron Sorkin's life. The sharper his voice became, the fewer people were allowed to hear it up close.